Let the Exodus begin. Good morning. Welcome to Ashland Center Church of Christ. It's good to be here with you all. And today we're going to continue our new series, How Great is Our God? And if you remember from last week, we're using GREAT as our acronym to walk through the events that we examined to help us focus on and learn from what's being presented to us. As promised, we've got a PowerPoint to help us remember what the acronym stands for. I'll put the main points up with it as I go through, but for now, let's walk through again to refresh our minds on what the GREAT stands for. So the G is for the goal. What is God's goal in this, whatever episode we're going through? What is he wanting to accomplish? R stands for reveal. What does God reveal about himself, about his character, about how he interacts with his people? E is for extraordinary. What is extraordinary about what God is doing in this episode? A is for ask. Is God asking us to respond in some particular way? And T is for teach. What is God teaching us through the particular episode? So now that we've all got that down, that's memorized, right? Everybody knows exactly what that means. Everyone's going to remember that forever. Let's get down and examine our scripture, our text for today. We're actually in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. At once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out to the tent of meeting, all three of you. So the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease, and he said to Moses, please, my Lord, I ask you not to hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like a stillborn infant coming from its mother's womb with its flesh half eaten away. So Moses cried out to the Lord, please, God, heal her. The Lord replied to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that, she can be brought back. So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until she was brought back. After that, the people left Hazeroth and encamped in the desert of Paran. So our passage begins with Moses' siblings, his brother and sister, initiating a questioning of his leadership. And beyond that, his status before God. And this is the second instance of rebelliousness against leadership that we've experienced in the 2 chapters of Numbers that we've gone through so far. Last week, we experienced it, though not necessarily at face value. Last week, we talked about the rabble among the Israelites that complained about God's provision. And they decided that all that manna, that heavenly flour, just wasn't good enough. But it wasn't just about the food. It's also a complaint about God's leadership. They were unsatisfied with how God was running things. In particular, to that episode, the way that he was feeding them. And back to this current passage, apparently it was the ethnicity of Moses' wife, or one of his wives, that was the instigating factor. Or perhaps it was just the straw that broke the camel's back for his siblings. Now, we don't know if this Cushite wife that they're talking about is Zipporah, the woman who is mentioned as Moses' first wife, or if it's another woman that he's married since. The thought is that If it were Zipporah, why would Miriam wait so long to bring up an issue? But in any case, the Cushite wife of Moses is not an Israelite, whether it's Zipporah that they refer to or not. And Miriam, because she's listed first in this episode, seems to be the instigator of this particular rebellion. They begin to question why Moses is in charge. And they list their own involvement with leadership as God's instruments. Has God spoken only through Moses? Hasn't God spoken through us too? Aaron's place is that of high priest. He gives to the people what God gives to Moses, and he and the rest of the priesthood facilitate worship. And they facilitate the atonement practices required by God's law. As such, Aaron is a voice of God to the people. And it's not just Aaron. If you go to Exodus 15:20, we learn that Miriam is a prophet. It says, "Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing." We don't know the extent of her role as prophet, but we do know that she was one. And that actually comes into play later in the passage. So according to them, both Miriam and Aaron have been used as vocal instruments for God. How come, then, and perhaps especially with his intermarriage, has Moses achieved the highest leadership position in the nation? If God has spoken through all three of us, how come he's the special one? In fact, wasn't it Moses who complained when he met God in the burning bush that he was slow of speech and tongue? Are Aaron and or Miriam more qualified? Are they more deserving? Perhaps they think so. So then in verse 3, we have a narrator's commentary. At least I hope it's the narrator's commentary, because if it's not, it's possibly the most ironic statement in the Bible. Moses is the most humble man on the face of the planet. So hopefully that is not Moses writing that about himself. We're told that Moses is the most humble man, but why? Why does the narrator bring this up? As I see it, it tells us something about the character of Moses. Something specifically that the narrator feels is important to the story. The first is that as far as Moses is concerned, he's innocent in this interaction. It's not as though the three of them were having a conversation about who should be in charge, and Moses is saying, well, of the three of us, I am clearly the best for the job. Right? Moses hasn't had any part of this interaction. He's innocent. In fact, if you recall, in the last chapter, he was pleading with God for relief from the position that he was in. Remember, if this is what I'm going to have to deal with, and I'm going to have to shoulder this burden all by myself, just wipe me out. He couldn't do it anymore. And so God gave him 70 people to help him. From what we know, he hasn't done anything to provoke his siblings. And second, it says something about the response to the rebellion. Moses was not responsible for the consequences of Miriam and Aaron's actions. It wasn't Moses who heard them talking, right? That was God. It wasn't as though Moses took issue with their statements. It's not like he overheard them saying that stuff and went, God, is that? Right? In fact, if you were to read Timothy Ashley's commentary, if the narrator is correct, even if Moses had heard them, he might have just taken it in stride because he wasn't prideful about his position. But that's speculation because it wasn't Moses who heard them. It was God. God did take issue with what they had to say. He took issue with their jealousy and pride. And so God summons Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. Moses, as far as we know, oblivious to this point why this meeting is taking place. Once there, God comes down to meet them. Only for this meeting, Moses is left back. He's there at the tent of meeting, but he is not part of the address. God calls Moses and Miriam, or Aaron and Miriam, to come and listen to him. And he says, when there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face. I speak clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why weren't you afraid to speak out against him? God directly addresses their roles as prophets among the people, right? What does he say about his prophets? First off, there's something that's lost in the NIV translation. The language indicates that God, not that God will reveal himself, but that he might reveal himself. When he says, and there's a prophet, and I reveal myself, is I may reveal myself. There's no guarantee as a prophet that you have consistent two-way communication with God. As prophet, when God speaks, you speak. If he chooses to reveal something for someone through you, it's your job then to speak it. Then there's the nature of the revealing. With the prophets, God revealed himself in visions or dreams, and the message might even be in riddles. Thus is the nature of the ministry of Aaron and Miriam and their relationship with God. This is contrasted with the nature of God's relationship with Moses. As far as Moses is concerned, he holds a special place with God, right? God says he is faithful in all my house. When God talks with Moses, he does it face to face. Not in a vision, not in a dream, but face to face. Moses sees the form of the Lord. It might be likened to a conversation. God doesn't speak in riddles to Moses. He talks plainly to you. This is what I want. This is what I expect. This is what you need to tell people. God makes plain to Miriam and Aaron the nature of his relationship to Moses. And keeping that nature in mind, then God asked the question, why weren't you afraid to talk bad about him? Why weren't you afraid to consider yourselves his equal, or perhaps his better? If this is my relationship with Moses, if this is how that works. So if we consider these things, is it any wonder that God was angry with Miriam and Aaron? And because of their sin, God brought punishment. And perhaps because of her primary role in the instigation, perhaps because of Aaron's role as high priest, or a combination of those or other things, Miriam is the one who immediately suffered for their sin. But losing her seemed to be a punishment for Aaron as well. He didn't take her defiling skin disease all that well. And having to go to Moses for intercession is just poetic justice. In opposition to the thoughts of equality or superiority, Aaron needs to go to Moses and ask, please spare Miriam. Please have God spare Miriam. And Moses, the most humble man on the face of the earth, acquiesces to the request. He intercedes with God for Miriam. And God's response is interesting to me. And also, I was struggling with a word here, but comforting. And that might seem strange, but I'll try to explain. See, God doesn't heal Miriam immediately. He doesn't say, okay, Moses, I hear you. Right? He forces Miriam to live outside the camp for 7 days. She has to be out of community for 7 days, out of God's immediate presence for 7 days. She has to follow the prescription for a defiling skin disease that's laid out in the law, and it's compared to a daughter being shown contempt or shame by her father, and God compares it to a father spitting in his daughter's face. And I could be way off base, and I know this might seem a strange thing to say, but that's the comforting part to me. Because I see a connection that even in his anger, even with the resulting punishment for Miriam, God is treating Miriam as what? A child, a daughter who's done wrong. There's not a permanent punishment, right? He doesn't give her leprosy and she passes from that. It's one that lasts for a time and with a purpose, to teach Miriam a lesson, not just to her, but to the community. Because what does it tell us in Numbers? The community waits for her to return before they move on. So they all know what happened. So let's move the passage into our acronym. What's God's goal in this event? God confirmed Moses' unique status among his servants and his status of leadership. See, Moses was the one that God chose to lead Israel. It was Moses that God appeared to in a burning bush. It was Moses that God made concessions for when he insisted that he wasn't the guy. Pick somebody else. I'm slow of speech and tongue. Fine, I'll get somebody to talk for you. Who am I to go before Pharaoh? I will give you things to show Pharaoh. It was Moses that God empowered through the Spirit, and it was Moses to whom God spoke face to face. God reminded Miriam, Aaron, and the rest of Israel who his guy was. What does God reveal about himself through this episode? I think he reveals himself in 2 ways. He showed how he communicates with his people through his conversation with Miriam and Aaron. He showed that when I have a prophet, this is how I deal with prophets. When I have a specific chosen leader for Israel, at least in Moses' case, this is how I interact with him. And the fact that he revealed himself not only to Moses, who got the face-to-face conversations, but Aaron and Miriam finally had one. And what's extraordinary about this episode? Through Miriam's leprosy and healing, God interacted with the physical world in a very immediate way. The language lets you know that it was not like they had the meeting and she went home and woke up in the morning and had leprosy. It was immediate. And he cleansed her after 7 days. It was a punishment and hopefully a reminder of God's choosing of Moses to lead Israel. Does God ask us anything specific from this episode? Again, here as last week, I don't see a direct ask of us. Nothing that God's saying, read this and go do this specific thing. But it is inferred that they are to respect Moses as God's choice for leadership. And what does God teach us through this episode with Miriam, Aaron, and Moses? Don't question or challenge God's establishment of leadership because of jealousy, anger, or hate. In the same vein, don't question the roles in which God places his people. Don't be jealous of another's status before God. Don't be jealous of someone else's place in God's kingdom. Each member has something to do. Miriam was a prophetess. Not everybody in Israel was a prophet. She had a particular role to play. Aaron was high priest. He directed worship. He and the priesthood helped with the atonement sacrifices, with the cleansing of the temple, with helping keep the community pure. He had a place in Israel. He had a place in God's kingdom. Each member has something to do, something that God has empowered them to do. Don't be jealous of somebody else's gift or place. Use your gift and your place to encourage the body, to strengthen the body, and to help others do the same. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you, and we are thankful for the grace that you have given us, that you have allowed us to be a part of your kingdom. Whatever part you have for us to play, Father, I ask that you would show us that part, empower us to do that part, and get us excited to do that part. Give us a humble spirit, a serving spirit, to do what it is that you ask of us and help others to do the same. We ask these things in Jesus' name.